going on, everybody? Average Arcader here, and welcome to the very first episode of the Average Arcader show. Before we get started on our first episode, I just want to say thank you to everyone who came over from the previous channel, my main channel, Average Arcader, which is primarily a Minecraft channel. The reason why I started a second channel was because with YouTube, you cannot do a multiple channel, especially when you're small like me, you're trying to grow. You have to kind of stick with the same thing. Now if you're huge, you can do whatever you want, but when you're a smaller channel, you kind of got to stick with the same thing. So my Average Arcader, my first channel, will primarily maintain a Minecraft channel, but I love video games. As you can see, I've played them all my life, and I wanted to come up with unique ways of covering a more broader span of video games. So I had to start another channel so that I could do a traditional video game channel, because I didn't want to just erase all the work I did on my original channel. I love Minecraft and I will always play it, so it's going to stay a primary Minecraft channel. But that's why I started the Average Arcader show, so that I can focus on other games too and start making videos of them as well. So without further ado, let's go ahead and get started on our very first episode. I hope you guys enjoy. I recently played through Halo Infinite, and I had such a good time playing through it, the campaign. It made me want to go back through the whole series of games. As I was doing this, I decided, why don't I cover the Halo series on my new channel? But do it by bringing back one of my old segments that I used to do on my main channel before I switched it over to a mainly Minecraft channel. So let me introduce you guys to Cost to the Boss. So in Cost to the Boss, we take the factions of groups or armies you may fight in a video game, calculate how many you fight, and then using as much lore as we can get our hands on for the games, we calculate how many resources or money it would cost to maintain that force. Basically, calculating how much we cost the boss. Now, bear with me. When I came up with this name, I was mostly playing Sega games where you fight gangs and crime lords. So there was literally a boss character. So, give me a break here. It's not a complicated name, but it's a fun one. So, getting back to Halo. Now, I'm going to cover all the main games of the series, from Halo Combat Evolved to Halo Infinite. I may come back around and do some of the spin-off games like Halo Wars, but I'm pretty much going to focus on the main games of the series for now. Today, we're going to be covering Halo Combat Evolved, which, believe it or not, was not my introduction into the Halo franchise. Halo 3 was, and I can't wait to cover that one because it's one of my favorite Halo games, as well as one of my favorite first-person shooters of all time. But after playing it, I was hooked to the series, and I went and played 1 and 2 immediately after completing 3. So, Halo Combat Evolved. What can I say about it that hasn't already been said? It's truly an amazing game that completely changed the first-person genre when it first came out, with its epic open levels and unique physics system. Now, if you want a complete breakdown of this game, I would suggest you watch one of the many well-done reviews of this game that you can find on YouTube. But for now, we're going to be focusing on the enemies that you fight in the game. Remember, my goal is to figure out how the enemy factions function. To do that, we're going to need to take a little look at some of the lore. And yes, I know there's 2 enemy factions in Halo Combat Evolved, but I'm only going to be focusing on one of them today. That's going to be the Covenant. Mainly because the Flood, well, I hate the Flood. They're annoying, and also it's pretty much impossible to count all of them during gameplay. In fact, I'm pretty sure in certain sections of the game, there's like an endless wave of them. So that's going to throw off numbers, and I don't feel like doing it. Moving on. So, who are the Covenant? Well, they're basically a giant alien cult. You see, the 2 founding species of the Covenant, the Sengeti, the Elites, and the Sanshium, or the Prophets, both worship an ancient alien race called the Forerunners as gods. but they had a disagreement with how to handle the technology left behind by the Forerunners. So, like all major civilizations, when they have a disagreement, they fought to the death. For 86 years. Eventually, the elite surrendered, even though technically they were at a stalemate, with both sides realizing they'd never be able to fully annihilate the other side. But the prophets still had a slight advantage because they had greater technology and due to the fact that they controlled a giant Forerunner ship that was basically unstoppable during the war. Either way, both species realized that they could benefit from one another, so they formed an alliance, thus starting the Covenant. Now, this is a huge abbreviation. If you're interested in learning the full story, I highly recommend you look up one of the many lore videos that goes over what happened in full detail. There's just too much that happens in these backstories for these lore for me to cover all here. So I would highly recommend doing that if you want to get the full picture. Now, moving on. So, as you can see, the Covenant had a really bloody start. Quite frankly, the bloodiness continues, seeing that whenever they would discover a new species, they would either force it to join them or completely annihilate them. So many of the species that we see in the Covenant were actually forced to join. This is important because it helps us figure out what the cost of running the Covenant would be. Which, from what I can see, the main cost would be the basic necessities of life, food and water. Now, how did I come up with that? Well, remember when I compared the Covenant to a religious cult earlier? This is because they legit are. When a species is strong-armed into joining the Covenant, they were normally pushed to also accept the religious beliefs too. That means the Forerunners are gods, and the prophets are their mouthpiece. Therefore, you must obey the prophets. Now, most of the species that joined the Covenant accepted this premise, except for like 2 of them. But we'll go over them in more detail later when I'm going over the individual species that we fight in-game. The point is, when you have a government being ran by a highly controlling religion like this, it doesn't leave a lot of room for people getting paid. Now, if you dig into the extended lore, you can find some small mentions of a currency that was traded within the Covenant, but it was only traded with a few species. One of them I'll mention later, and even then, it was more so for the higher-ups within that species. There's not too many mention of low-ranking species getting paid, so I'm not really going to apply this because I don't have enough information on it, and I cannot find any more from what I can see in-game and in the extended lore. The Covenant did not pay their soldiers. They were more so rewarded with resources like food or standing in the religion. Okay, so now that I have a general idea on how I might calculate the cost, now let's get into the individual species that we fight in Halo Combat Evolved. First up is the Elites. We already gone over their history in starting the Covenant, but let's actually get into them as an actual species so that we can better figure out what their cost might be. The Elites, or the Sengeti, are a humanoid reptilian species with an average height of 7 to 8 feet and an average weight of 300 to 400 pounds. These are some big boys, and they definitely can do a lot of damage when you fight them in game. They're going to be the main heavy hitters that we fight when fighting the Covenant forces. So what would be their cost? Well, remember, they are true believers in the Covenant religion at this time. Serving the prophets is a reward within itself. That means the only thing they'll probably be granted for their services is access to better gear and food. So that leaves us with food as their main cost. Now some might be thinking, why not gear too? Well, gear can be recovered or passed down to successors. In fact, within the lore, we can see things like this happening. But once food is eaten, it cannot be recovered. Well, I mean, it can, but you're not going to want it. At least you shouldn't want it anyway. So the next big question is, how much did the elites eat? Well, looking through the lore, I wasn't able to find any exact information about the eating habits of any of the species that are mentioned in the game. That means we're going to need to find a real world equivalent to go with. Now, with the elites, I'm definitely going to compare them to Earth reptiles because they share many characteristics to Earth reptiles. For instance, their skin is similar and they reproduce similarly by laying eggs. Now, there is a huge debate within the fandom that you should not compare them to Earth reptiles, but unfortunately, I have nothing else to compare them with. Also, if you take the time to look at the lore, they evolved on a planet very similar to Earth, which is why they can breathe the same atmospheres as humans can. So if they evolved on a planet similar to Earth, it would make sense that they share some of the same features as some of the species on Earth. Look, I'm no biologist. I'm just going with what makes sense to me. If you guys have a better explanation to what they could be, let me know in the comment section down below. But what real wood reptile would I use as a baseline for the elites? Well, alligators, of course. Alligators are the only reptiles on Earth that could match up physically with the elites. When it comes to their size and weight, they're pretty close. In fact, alligators actually may be a little bit taller if you transfer their length to height, and a little bit heavier when it comes to the weight. Now, alligators are cold-blooded, and this is important because it does actually affect their eating habits. I do not know if the elites are cold-blooded or not. The lore that I could get my hands on doesn't really go into that type of detail. Now, in-game, we do fight them in cold environments, and it doesn't seem to slow them down at all. But that could be because of their suits they're wearing could have some form of temperature controls that help regulate their inner temperature. We don't know for sure, but for now, I'm just going to assume that they're cold-blooded. So, how much food does an alligator need to eat? This is very interesting. If an alligator has access to food, it will pretty much eat regularly. But say if food is scarce, they can go a long time without eating. I'm talking sometimes, in extreme cases, they can go a whole year without eating. Now, this is due to their very slow metabolism. You also have to remember that alligators are predators, so finding and catching food isn't always something they're going to be able to do easily. But if they are able to regularly get food, the average adult alligator can survive off 1 meal a week. Now, I know that doesn't sound like much, but you gotta understand 1 meal to an adult alligator could be around 17 kilograms or 37 pounds worth of food. So, can we apply this to the elites? Well, we can, but we have to play around with some of the numbers. Here's why. Now, the elites are predators, like alligators, but they're part of a civilization. They're not a lone predator hunting out in the wild, only able to eat when they catch food. Within the Covenant, there are farmers, gatherers, food stores, rations. That means they can have regular access to food, so they're going to have more opportunities to eat than your average alligator would. That means their meals aren't going to need to be as big, since they eat more regularly. Now, that being said, we can clearly see that the Covenant is the type of group that would expect its members to perform with the basics, allowing them to grant them slight upgrades based off performance. We clearly see this, as there is a difference between a lower ranking soldier's gear and a higher ranking one. We have to assume that this would also apply to their food rations. That means we need to come up with an amount of food that could represent the basic food rations. So, using alligators as a starting point, and then applying what we know about the social structure of the Covenant, we can make an educated guess that it would be around 12 pounds of food a week as your average ration for an elite. But what about water? Hydration is just as important as food. In fact, for most animals, hydration is more important than food. This is definitely the case when it comes to alligators, for they can only last without some form of hydration if the conditions are right for at the most a week. So, assuming that elites are similar reptiles to alligators, their water requirements should be similar as well. Now, if we want to calculate what this requirement would be, we'll have to go based off their weight. This is because there is no exact measurement that we could pull up for alligators because they get their hydration from several different sources, like from the water they are submerged in and the animals they eat. So the average weight of an elite is around 139 to 178 kilograms, or 307 to 393 pounds. The average reptile should drink between 10 to 30 milliliters of water per kilogram of weight per day. That equals out to around 2 to 4 liters of water a day. Using this, we can estimate average water rations for the elite would be around 14 liters of water a week. Okay, we're done with the elites for now. Let's move on to the next in-game race, the hunters. The hunters, or the Lekgolo, are a species of worm-like creatures that when in large numbers create a hive mind that increases their intelligence. The Lekgolo were first discovered by the Covenant when they arrived at their homeworld, looking for Forerunner artifacts. And just like all the other species that they first find, they instantly attack them. Now, granted, they kinda had a good reason of doing it. This time, the Lekgolo were eating the Forerunner artifacts that they were there for, so they kinda just looked like a mindless infestation. At first, it wasn't until after they tried exterminating them that they realized that they were much more than that. Mainly because they formed master figures out of the surrounding materials and themselves to fight the Covenant. And the Lekgolo did a pretty good job defending themselves, pretty much winning all the ground battles against the Covenant forces. And the Covenant couldn't just use their ships to blast them away because they were still living amongst the Forerunner artifacts that they were there for. So they would destroy those relics if they wanted to completely destroy the Lekgolo. Eventually, an arbiter was appointed to deal with the situation, and he recommended that instead of destroying the Lekgolo, they should be tamed and invited into the Covenant. This idea was accepted, and after some initial difficulties with communication, the Lekgolo were tamed and joined the Covenant. Okay, so now that we know a little bit about their history, let's calculate the cost. To do that, we need to first figure out what the Lekgolo are so that we can figure out a real-world equivalent. So, thanks to pictures and descriptions in the lore, we know that the Lekgolo are a worm-like species that pretty much can eat anything that it can break down. Also, they're actually pretty big worms, seeing that the average size is around 4 to 5 feet. Now, it was here that I thought I was pretty much stuck because I didn't think worms on Earth could get that big. Well, I was wrong. In fact, there's a species of earthworm that can actually get bigger, averaging around 3 to 9 feet. So we have a real world equivalent. So, how much do they eat? Well, worms in general eat about half their body weight per day. Now, the average Lekgolo worm weighs around 13 pounds. That means they should eat an average of 6.5 pounds of food per day. Now, when you're fighting a pair of hunters, you're really fighting a colony of worms. How many worms are in that colony? I don't know. There are no official numbers of the exact amount of worms in a colony in the lore. At least I couldn't find it. But I did manage to find an official weight for the individual hunter forms. So the average hunter weighs around 10,000 pounds. There's normally 2 hunters, so that would mean that the average colony weight is around 20,000 pounds. So if the average worm weighs around 13 pounds, all we have to do is divide 20,000 by 13, and that should give us our total number of Lekgolo worms per colony. So 20,000 divided by 13 gives us 1,538 worms. Now, seeing that each worm would eat around 6.5 pounds of food per day, that will bring our total food consumption per day per colony to around 10,000 pounds of food. Now, I know what you're thinking. Average, couldn't you have just figured that out by basically cutting the 20,000 pounds in half? And the answer to that is yes. Moving on. What about hydration? Now, this is where it gets tricky. Worms do need some form of hydration, but not to consume or drink. They need it in their environment. You see, worms do not have lungs. They breathe through their skin. Now, the only way this process can work is if their skin is not dry. It has to have moisture. Otherwise, they'll suffocate. Now, they can also drown if they have too much moisture. That is why you see earthworms come out of the ground when it rains and gather on your driveway. They are literally trying not to drown. So you see, it's not about consumption of water, it's all about staying moisturized. Because of this, I don't think I'll set a water ration for the Lekkerli, because they really just need a moisturizer of some kind, and you don't need water 100% for that. There could be other things they could use, and I have no idea or way of knowing what that is or even how to measure how much they would use. So we're just gonna leave that one blank. It's time to move on to our next in-game species, the jackals, or the Kigyar. The Kigyar are interesting. They are a reptile/avian species of space birds. In fact, that's pretty much all they did before joining the Covenant: attack and plunder any ship they came across. This motto of attack first, ask questions later is actually what led the Kigyar into attacking the Covenant when they entered their home system and started a large-scale naval war, which the Kigyar were actually holding their ground in rather well. This is because their home system is basically a giant asteroid field, and the bigger Covenant ships could maneuver well through them, giving the smaller Kigyar ships the advantage. But even with this advantage, the Kigyar knew that it was only a matter of time before they were overwhelmed by the Covenant forces. This, plus the idea they can make a lot of profit by expanding their trade with the resources they can get from the Covenant, they decided to join them, but basically as paid mercenaries. Now, it's going to be kind of hard to calculate a cost for the Kigyar. This is for a couple of different reasons. Number one, as a whole, they never fully accepted the Covenant religion. Like mercenaries, they were there for their resources. There's even mention in the lore, like I said earlier, about a currency that they traded with, but I don't have any information on this currency, or at least not that much information. And from what I can see, it was mainly only traded with high-ranking Kigyar. So the lower-ranking ones, the ones we mainly fight in the games, wouldn't have direct access to it. So I'm not going to be able to use it. Also, another part of their payment would have been the right to still basically act like pirates and plunder all the enemy ships of the Covenant that they could find. Something else that we just not going to be able to calculate. So it looks like, again, we're going to have to rely on food as a main cost. But that brings up my second problem with the Kigyar. What are they? Remember, they have characteristics from both reptiles and birds. Now, many might say, well, average, they're pretty close, it shouldn't matter. And that's right, they do have some similarities, but they are still two different species, and Kigyar have features from both of them. Some Kigyar favor one more than the other, like skirmishers, for instance, definitely favoring birds, while others favor reptiles. But I would say, after looking through the lore and observing them in game, that Kigyar have more similarities to birds than they do reptiles. For instance, all of them have beak-shaped mouths, and their bone structure, especially when it comes to their hands and legs, are very close to birds. It's also assumed that they are warm-blooded like most birds. This is assumed because for the most part, they wear very light gear. We do see them in this gear in cold climates in-game, and it doesn't seem to affect them. But just like the elites, we don't know if there's not some type of climate system built into the gear or not. But from what we can see the Kit Yar wearing, at least in the first game, it wouldn't seem like it does. So after considering all of this, I decided to go with a bird for a real world equivalent. And that bird is the common ostrich. Believe it or not, ostriches match up rather well to jackals, especially when it comes to their height and weight. So their dietary needs should be similar. So how much does an ostrich need to eat? So an ostrich, if it has access to enough food, can eat around 3 pounds of food a day. That means that the Kit Yar would have a similar food ration per week as the elites, around 20 pounds of food a week. Hydration is very similar too. Ostriches get most of their hydration from the plants that they eat, but if they come across fresh water sources, they will drink. The average intake of water is around 2 to 3 liters a day. That would mean water rations for the Kit Yar will be similar to the elites as well, around 14 liters per week. Okay, we still have one more species to go through before we can start doing our final calculations. The grunts, or the Ungoi. The grunts have a unique relationship with the average Halo gamer. One second you feel sorry for them, the next you're ready to blow their brains out when they tag you with a plasma grenade from across the map. Now, as annoying as they may be, it's interesting to go through their backstory and see everything these little grenade throwers have been through. Now, unfortunately, there's just way too much information for me to go through here. So I'll mainly be focusing on their backstory with the Covenant, but I would highly recommend that if you are interested to go look up some of the mini lore videos that cover it, because these little guys have been through a lot. Now, when the Covenant first discovered the Grunts' homeworld, they handled it a little bit differently than they did the other species that joined the Covenant. Yes, they pretty much attacked them unprovoked, but there was no long, drawn-out battle. It was almost an instant conquer, because the Grunts just did not have the strength or technology to really put up a fight with the Covenant, and became one of the first species to completely surrender by force 100% to join the Covenant. There was no mutual agreement or understanding. It was you're joining whether you like it or not. And believe it or not, this was the best case scenario for them, because originally they were just going to destroy all the Grunts. But when they saw they had a crazy fast ability to reproduce, they figured they could use it to their advantage, thus sparing the race. Now, don't get me wrong, this might have been the best case scenario, but it still was a horrible scenario for the Grunts, because they were basically cannon fodder to be thrown at the enemy to distract from the other Covenant members. They didn't even give them weapons, they just had them run around unarmed just so they can get shot at. And this mistreatment wasn't just on the battlefield. Off the battlefield, every single species in the Covenant looked down upon and mistreated the Grunts, especially when it came to the Kit Yar. The Kit Yar, being only one rank above the Grunts, saw them as a threat to their positions, both in rank and in actual physical location. You see, because of them both being the lowest ranking species in the Covenant, they lived in the same areas, and because of the Grunts' overwhelming ability to reproduce, they were somewhat pushing the Kit Yar out of areas that they lived. This caused the Kit Yar to start openly attacking the Grunts, trying to thin their numbers. This eventually leads to the Kit Yar attempting to make a significant portion of the Grunts' population sterile, and the leadership of the Covenant do absolutely nothing about it. This is the breaking point for the Grunts, and they start a rebellion. And the little guys actually hold their own. Because of their large numbers, once they got their hands on weapons, they could cause significant amount of damage. Unfortunately, though, the rebellion does not last long. It is eventually quelled, but the grunts emerge from this failed rebellion with a little bit more respect from the other Covenant races, and they grant them a position of actually being armed infantry instead of just cannon fodder. Well, truthfully, they're still cannon fodder, but now they're cannon fodder with guns that can actually defend themselves somewhat. Okay, so we've got a little bit of their history, but let's take a look at their biology, and I'm gonna be honest with you, this is where I ran into a dead end, and not from lack of information. There's plenty of information on the grunts' biology. If anything, maybe too much, because the grunts' biology is all over the place. They have features from reptiles, mammals, crabs, insects, you name it, they've got it. They've got an exoskeleton and an endoskeleton. There's only a few species on Earth that have both, and none of them are really a matchup for the grunts. Needless to say, I don't think I can find a real-world equivalent to the grunts. They have too many characteristics of too many different species, and they do not really favor any of them. But that doesn't mean we can't come up with a cost. We can estimate it based off the history with the Covenant and based off what the other Covenant species get. Remember, they're still the lowest of the low. Even after Rebellion, when they earned some respect, it wasn't that much. They basically just earned the right to arm themselves and to actually be armed infantry. They're still pretty much mistreated by every Covenant species there is. This would mean that they would probably get the bare minimum when it comes to food rations. This is somewhat backed up in the games. If you listen to the grunts banter sometimes, they'll talk about how getting access to more food is a reward for them. It would only be a reward if they weren't getting that much in the first place. Now, keeping this in mind, I would say that the grunts would have a food ration around 15 pounds of food a week and 10 liters of water a week. Now, we're not done with the grunts when it comes to their cost. There's actually one more thing we need to account for, and that is the methane tanks. Now, for those of you who do not know, grunts do not breathe oxygen like the rest of the Covenant species do. They breathe methane. And when not in specially made environments for them, they have to breathe from a methane tank that is stored in the back of their armor. Now, one methane tank can last a grunt around 120 hours. That would mean that they would need to refill or change the tank at least once a week. That means we need to add one methane tank per week to the grunt's cost. Okay, that's all the Covenant species that we encounter in Halo Combat Evolved. Now it's time to count how many of these guys we actually fight and come up with a final total cost. Now, what I did to come up with this count was play through the game while recording and then going back through the recording counting the different enemies. So if my numbers are different from your own, it's probably because I might have missed a few. Okay, so in Halo Combat Evolved, we fight a total of 302 elites, 293 jackals, 791 grunts, and 60 hunters. Now, if we account for the individual Agolo worms within each hunter, we will get a grand total of 46,140 worms. Alright, so let's count their costs. The elites will eat a total of 6,040 pounds of food per week and drink around 4,228 liters of water. The jackals will eat around 5,860 pounds of food and drink 4,102 liters of water. Grunts will eat a grand total of 11,865 pounds of food and 7,910 liters of water. Also, let's not forget that they will also consume around 791 tanks of methane. The hunters, on the other hand, will eat 300,000 pounds of food a day. their weekly consumption will come up to around 2,100,000 pounds of food per week. That will give us a weekly total of 2,123,765 pounds of food, 16,240 liters of water, and 791 methane tanks. A monthly total of 8,495,060 pounds of food, 64,960 liters of water, and 3,164 methane tanks. A yearly total of 97,485,180 pounds of food, and 770,880 liters of water, and 37,968 methane tanks. Now remember, this is just the impact, just the cost of the forces that we face in-game in Halo Combat Evolved. This is not an overall force for the Covenant, and I'm not even sure how we would even calculate that. This is just the impact we had on the forces that we fight on that Halo ring in the first Halo game. Now, I'm going to tell you, going into this, I didn't think these numbers were going to get that high. So I was very shocked when I did the number calculating and crunched those numbers and they came up this high for these individual things. If you think about it, Master Chief fights around 1,446 individual enemies within that game. Technically over 47,000 if you count the individual Agolo worms, but we're not going to do that. If you guys enjoyed this video, make sure to leave a like, share, subscribe, and hit that notification button, because I will be doing the whole entire main series. Like I said earlier in the video, I will be covering them all on the Cost of the Boss little segment here, as well as I will be doing other segments on this channel. Remember, this is going to be a broader channel covering more games than just one, so I'm never going to just be one thing. So what about you guys? Do you have any games you think this would work, this formula would work on? Why don't you give us some recommendations down in the comment sections down below. And thanks again to everyone who came over from my main channel, Average Arcader, the Minecraft channel. Any of you guys that came over to check this out, thank you. And any new people who stayed to the end to this video, thank you again. This is a start on a new thing for me, for my new channel, and I appreciate the support. So thank you very much, and I hope you guys stay tuned, because we'll have a lot more coming from this channel. All right, guys, I am Average Arcader, and I will see you in the next video.